A different perspective on Asia's influence now, on how it's changing relations in the region. This time from India, also a major and growing Asian economic power. Dhruva Jaishankar is a foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington and New Delhi. And he spoke to us from New Delhi. When Asia is mentioned, particularly in the West, the first thing that comes to mind is often China. How is China's rise in influence perceived from your perspective, in the region particularly?
I think it's a cliche now that Asia is rising, and a big reason for that rise has been China's rise. China is by far the second largest economy in the world today. It's the largest exporter, the largest energy user. And in many ways, China's rise has helped to drive the global economy, including the Asian economy, including a country like India's. So it's helped consumers by lowering the costs of manufactured goods. It's created new opportunities. However, China's rise is also being accompanied by a great deal of concern in many countries around its periphery. In India, where I live, in Southeast Asia, in Japan, in Korea, in the United States, and of course in Canada as well. And in my mind, it's largely for four main reasons. One is China is an opaque system. It has an opaque system of governance. It's not very transparent. And as decisions made by China have global implications, it's not really very sustainable. And so in many cases, for example, China makes decisions that we don't quite understand why or how. And that, I think, causes great anxiety. A second reason is it's a non-market economy. It has the close relations between the state and private companies, which sometimes are not entirely private, and that creates various kinds of market distortion. The third reason is that China is in many ways acting in a revisionist manner. So it has territorial disputes with Japan, with several countries in Southeast Asia, with India, with Bhutan, and it's been acting in a manner that's trying to change the facts on the ground. And finally, China's been behaving in certain ways in a manner that seems to erode international norms, whether it is outer space, whether it's internet governance, cybersecurity, whether it's issues of connectivity, whether it's trade on many issues, and so non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation. And so for these reasons, China's rise has also been accompanied by a great deal of anxiety.
Mm. At the same time, and we've heard some in the United States and others too, look at some of the examples and the reasons that you talk about the wariness around China, and talk about a global power competition. And you suggested that it's a mistake to sort of come at this with what you call a Cold War mentality. What's the right way to look at China's drive for influence then?
Well, I actually think the Cold War mentality is partly useful, but like all historical analogies, it has its limitations, and it actually hides more than it reveals. On the one hand, I think there's no question that there's greater competition between the United States and China, and for the reasons I outlined, I think it's likely to intensify. And in that sense, we will see more of a decoupling, perhaps, of the US and Chinese economies, and other countries having to make some very difficult choices related to their relationships with the US and China. On the other hand, some things are clearly different. The world is much more globalized than it was during the Cold War, and so the economic dynamics are fundamentally different in many ways. I think it's not just China that's rising. You have other countries, India, Indonesia, countries in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa that are all rising at the same time. And this will mean that the dynamics will be quite dissimilar from the Cold War.
You know that there have been tensions, obviously, in the U.S.-China relationship. There's also been strains in the relationship with Canada, too. But more broadly within the region, and I ask this partly because you're sitting in India, what does this suggest about the right way for a country like Canada, for example, to approach relations, given the strains that are there within the region itself?
Well, I'm not sure I can speak for Canada at all. I think that these are very difficult decisions that Canadian leaders will have to make in the near future. But from India's point of view, I think one is we have a large boundary dispute. Obviously, that's something Canada doesn't have. But to put it in perspective, this is territory the size of Montana. It would be like the US and Canada contesting territory of that size, populated by 1.5 million people. So we do have an outstanding boundary dispute with China, and that is occasionally the cause of some tension. We have a massive trade deficit with China of $50 billion trade deficit, which is larger than India's spending on defense. We have some key differences on issues such as the Belt and Road Initiative, which India sees as a strategic project rather than this primarily economic and market-driven project that China is trying to project it to be. And we have differences over global governance. I think China sees itself in a very different league from India and doesn't want to make space for India's rise as well at the global high table. So for these reasons, we've seen India and China butting heads much more and more over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is likely to continue, although there's currently a thaw in relations. So I mention all of this because I think it is in some ways useful for other countries to observe how China is behaving with countries closer to its periphery.
Dhruva, I thank you very much for your expertise on this.
Thank you.